So we've got disinformation, misinformation, covert, inauthentic behaviour, fake news, the infodemic. You've probably noticed over the last year or so, there's a whole tangle of vocabulary that has become more and more prominent. Of course, over the whole lifetime of the pandemic, we've had the infodemic as well. But I want to talk about an idea which I think is kind of at the very core of all of that. It kind of sits behind it. And kind of is almost camouflaged by those words, but I think is better than any of those phrases and concepts for actually explaining how the world is being reshaped now, and certainly how the world is going to be reshaped in the future as well. But to explain this idea, to kind of introduce you to it, I want to tell a bit of a genealogy. I want to kind of try and trace the kind of origin story, if you will, and try and show you where the ideas come from and how it's changed and evolved and developed and expanded over the last decade or so into what it is today, in order to understand where it's going into the future as well. So we're going to go on a bit of a journey as I take you on the history of the idea of information warfare. And it begins in that place where so many things begin on the internet, with cats. So we're jumping back to 2003, and there on a then little known board called 4chan, lots and lots of people around the world were all kind of joining in order to kind of escape the kind of normies of normal life. From around the world, people were kind of beginning to be immersed in this kind of roiling, irreverent, sometimes unbelievably offensive series of online subcultures. And as they did so, kind of identity and belonging and meaning began to bubble up out of the internet. And all these people that lived on places like 4chan and this kind of constellation of other online spaces that were developing in parallel to it, they all kind of watched in 2003 onwards with horror as all the normies, all those corporations and banks and companies all joined them on their internet. Suddenly, companies were setting up websites, banks were setting up online banking portals. The internet was changing. It was turning more like offline life, and they were horrified by this. And, you know, in all these discussion boards, a kind of conversation began to evolve back then about what you do about all of this. How do we react, they were asking themselves, to a world where the normies were invading the internet? Well, their answer really was quite simple and powerful. If the normal world was going to invade their internet, then they were going to use the internet to invade the normal world. There on 4chan, they began to kind of pull together this whole literature, dopamine studies and cognitive psychology, and began to kind of develop something of a tradecraft. They heard that Justin Bieber was turning to the internet to work out where he was going to go on tour. So they hacked and manipulated the online poll to try and send him to North Korea. A classical form now, we would say that is online manipulation. Time magazine turned to the internet to ask who the Time Person of the Year should be. Well, they rigged that online poll as well, and not only put their leader, the founder of 4chan, Moot, at the very top, but they then rigged it so that every other name in the list all spelt Marble Cake Also the Game. That was one of a very large number of 4chan in-jokes at the time. Again, online manipulation. And they realised that they could kind of swarm a single point from a very large number of different places. And they did this with online games like Habbo Hotel. The reputation was then that Habbo Hotel was being racist in the way it was moderating that online game. So they swarmed. They wrote guides about how they should all log on at the same time and block the online exits and protest and form protest kind of swastikas in the pool. And they did what we would now call sock puppetry. They set up thousands upon thousands of different online accounts in order to emulate a crowd, in order to try and manipulate what was trending, to try and change the whole visage of how people thought that entire crowds and thousands of people were reacting. And they celebrated each and every one of these so-called operations with cats. Now, cats weren't a mistake either. They'd read in this kind of array of literature that they were piecing together and that they were beginning to compile and make sense of, that cats, one of the things that elicited a really, really strong emotional reaction in people. They're very similar to babies. You get this kind of burst of dopamine when you see a cat. So if you want to package up an idea to spread around the internet, they realised, you package it as a cat. So you had hacker cat, Nyan cat, ceiling cat. It was no mistake that cats began to spread around the internet. They were spreading around the internet because 4chan, amongst other people, realised that they were best suited to spread around the internet. Now, they didn't call this information warfare. They didn't call this fake news or misinformation or covert inauthentic behaviour or any of the other phrases that we now begin to describe this kind of thing. They simply called it lulz. For them, it was tremendously funny. It was a kind of act of exerting power over the offline world. And I think they were often astonished about how effective this kind of emerging tradecraft really was. And that was really chapter one. I think the origin of information warfare was in these online communities back in 2003 onwards. It was in this kind of eclectic people that were basically doing it because they found it funny or self-affirming or an act of power and agency to be able to do. But chapter two really is a question of how other people could never stay out of the game of online influence for very long. And people began to see what 4chan were doing. They began to see these operations, how remarkably effective they often were, how they were unbelievably good at hoovering up attention, getting people talking, even changing what people were beginning to think. And so chapter two is about how that world of the lulz became commercialized, and we began to see a world of disinformation on demand. So within a few minutes of searching on the darknet, you can come up with something like the huge mega bot pack. This is where you buy your Google bots, your Facebook bots, your Twitter bots, your LinkedIn auto likers scripts, which begin to allow you to manipulate online places, to begin to do things in very, very scaled ways. Again, without much searching at all, you can go onto websites to buy fake social media profiles, like you would any other commodity. You know, you've got your kind of cheap plonks on the one side, and you've got your kind of expensive aged vintages on the other, and you can buy them by the 100 or by the 1,000 in a kind of floating exchange rate. These websites often have like Gmail special days or Facebook special days, where they're kind of like, slash the prices, of certain accounts. And clearly, like the volumes passing through all of this means that there's a kind of like flourishing market for this kind of activity. And there's a whole kind of suite of different kinds of software which people began to develop, competing like any other piece of software for price and quality, in order to begin to command vast zombie armies of these fake social media accounts. So it began to industrialize the things that 4chan were doing for fun. This all became part of a world of dodgy PR, black hat search engine optimization, or as I found when I went to Kosovo, a whole different subculture of clickbait and fake news merchants. All young people, one of them was called Bessar, in their kind of mid to late 20s, all of whom were kind of shut out of other jobs or international labour markets, and all of whom have found that by amassing vast attentions on Facebook and then trying to monetize it by getting people to click on stories that were simply too shocking or simply too remarkable to be true, they can make far more money than they could through any other form of legitimate employment. And it was a subculture that had kind of on-ramps and kind of, entry-level positions within it. Bessar, amongst others, showed me on Facebook a whole network of closed groups where these Facebook fake news merchants actually trade and cooperate with each other. On screen right now, you are seeing a fake news starter pack. This is where young fledgling fake news merchants can buy the Facebook groups and can buy the content packs and can buy the monetization tricks in order to move into the industry. So what began with the lulz in chapter 2 expanded for the profit. And whether it was Bessar or whether it was the people making the software, what had started as a series of kind of grassroots kind of almost like kind of flexes for fun became much, much more industrialized in scale. It became something which people began to expand. It became something which corporates and other companies began to do. It became something which became increasingly attached to the kind of dodgiest parts of political campaigns. And as it did so, the barriers to entry into doing this kind of thing, online manipulation, the managing of vast amounts of fake accounts, the massaging of identities online, all of that became easier to do. But then chapter 3 is the crux. So this is where we get militaries involved. And from like 2005 onwards, like a stack of dominoes around the world, militaries were all kind of asking themselves the same question. We now live in the information age, these militaries said. We now live in an age where information is absolutely central to so many things. How, each of them asked themselves, how do we as militaries stay current? How do we as militaries keep up with the vast societal changes that we see happening around us? And the answer, in one way or another, whether you're a liberal democratic military or an autocratic one, was roughly the same. And each of these militaries, one after the other, rewrote their operational doctrines, I argue, to enshrine this new understanding of the relationship between militaries and information at the very heart of what militaries really were, of how they saw themselves. And this was an absolutely fundamental pivot. This is what my whole talk is about. Because information was flipped on its head. Information had gone from, as it has for millennia now, being a tool of war. It's always been a tool of war. It's always been used in war. You've always tried to manipulate the enemy's picture of the battlefield. You've always tried to use information to fool the enemy, to bluff. There's nothing new about that whatsoever. But what militaries did is they turned that around completely. So rather than information being used within a war, they saw that war happened within information. So information was changed from being a tool of war to being a theatre of war. And whether it was in the British operational doctrine or the Russian, one after the other, militaries all over the place basically began to recognise that fundamental fact. And really, the story of the world, in my eyes, since then, has simply been the kind of expansion of that idea as militaries have kind of changed their capabilities, has changed their investments, have changed the skill sets that they hire for and what they do in order to kind of grasp that basic realization that they needed to compete within information. They needed informational dominance. They needed to use mimetic weaponry. This whole kind of militarized vocabulary around information began to grow up in 48 different countries around the world now, sometimes used as a tool of domestic oppression, sometimes used as a tool of international geopolitics, whether it's happening in Russia or China or Saudi Arabia or the Philippines or Brazil. Information warfare is happening pretty much anywhere. It's happening during elections, of course. It's happening to try and influence vast geopolitical topics, climate change, female reproductive and sexual rights, vaccinology, public health. They're all kind of prey and influenced to that kind of thinking. Now, what does this mean? Number one, it doesn't mean that it's fake news. Very little of this has actually got to do with news at all, and little of this actually has got to do with fakery. I've interviewed people that do this kind of operations, and the one thing they tell me is we don't try and lie to you. It's much easier to manipulate people by telling them things, that making them even angrier about things that they already think are true about the world, and then guiding that outrage in one direction or another. Number two, this is as much a question of making some truths more visible than others as it is of causing kind of lies or falsehoods or disinformation to circulate. You can build an extremely distorted picture of the world simply by the judicious selection of some facts over other facts. Third, this hasn't actually always got a huge amount to do with facts at all. If you really break apart these operations as we know them, quite often what you see is this has to do with identity and belonging and meaning and kinship and massaging people's ideas of where they belong in the world. This has got to do with us as social beings and moral beings as much as it has to do with us being kind of rational intellectual ones. So this isn't just a question of digital literacy. But I think what is really clear already is we sit on the foothills of all of this stuff. And I think this is an idea which is only just getting going. We're only really in the early stages of what this idea is going to do to the world. I think some things are already clear. Firstly, this is really, really easy for militaries to do. This is technically really quite trivial. Compared to building a tank, this is really not difficult to manipulate online spaces. And when you have militaries that exist and think on decades-long horizons, the capabilities which they're going to be able to do this are going to get so sophisticated, there's actually probably quite little we can do in, say, in civic society or academia to detect them with it. Second, offense is beating defense at the moment quite reliably. So it's much easier to do this than it is to stop it. It's much easier to manipulate online spaces than it is to detect that manipulation. We know much more about how you do this, how you try and influence people's psychologies, how you see attention as a form of territory, how you see psychology as a form of strategy. We know much more about the prosecution of information warfare than we do know about the defensive responses to it. But then lastly, this is the one idea that I think we know very little about, and that is demilitarization, de-escalation, of actually calling a ceasefire. If we're ever going to, I mean, my real worry really is that information in information warfare is purely instrumental. So its whole job is basically to get you to either believe or behave in a certain way, or not believe or behave in a certain way. So the kind of like value of information itself becomes kind of drains away. It kind of begins to break apart. Which, if you're a writer or a researcher, or really anyone, obviously, that has a kind of a belief and an attachment to the kind of endemic value and civilizational importance of truth and information and genuine human communication with each other, information warfare has absolutely no place for any of that. So there's a kind of tactical question about how us in the West respond, and that conversation is going, and we are responding and probably will more in the future. But what I think we have not begun to discuss at all is how everyone can step back from the brink and actually begin to demilitarize and de-weaponize information in order to restore some of its kind of inherent, kind of endemic value unto itself back into it. So that's an origin story, 3 chapters. It began for the lulz, it expanded for the profit, and lastly, where we are now, this is a creature of warfare, I think. It's a creature of geopolitics, and it's a creature increasingly of states and their ends. That is the short, rapid-fire gallop through the current history of information warfare.
Well, that was absolutely phenomenal. I'm delighted to say Carl Miller joins us now. Carl, hello.
Hi there, everyone. Morning.
Well, that has already set our green room buzzing, I can assure you, Carl, and I've got some questions piling in, so let's cut straight to it. By the way, if you're tuning in live and you've got a question, then pop that out on the question tab and fire it in. We've just got a few minutes. Carl, thank you for that. I've got some rapid fire questions, each one we could talk about for a long time, but I'm going to ask you to be fairly punchy in your responses. The first question comes in, it's about the major platforms, about Facebook, Google, LinkedIn. Can they be forced to be accountable globally? What do you think?
Yeah, online safety bill, very recently legislation being tabled in the UK, but they're certainly going to become more accountable for various kinds of harms on their platforms. They're never going to be able to solve these issues themselves, largely because they are private companies that can only levy very limited penalties on the people seeking to actually prosecute things like information warfare. You know, it's kind of like asking a private company to solve the Cold War. They simply don't have the levers at their disposal to do so. Yeah. In many ways, to my mind, what we're doing at the moment is a necessary but not sufficient condition in moving us forwards from the kind of warfare we're now seeing online.
Isn't the challenge, Carl, that they gaze across from their Silicon Valley layers and sort of end up cocking a snook, saying, I see your online bill and I reject it?
Yeah, but there's also a challenge that we think that simply berating and slamming big tech is actually going to get us to the answer. And we spent 10 years now basically calling on big tech to take more responsibility. And the fact that they haven't has been really clear, I think, for almost all of us in this space to see. But it also isn't actually the entire point.
Yeah.
Where's the informational defence pacts in NATO? Where's international legislation around foreign intervention in elections online?
Yeah.
Where's deterrence theory being deployed to stop states do this kind of thing?
Yeah.
There's an entire architecture outside of the tech giants which needs to be rebuilt, which we've always relied on to protect ourselves from hostile state intervention, amongst other interventions, of course.
Yeah.
And that's simply not happening here at all.
Yeah, got it. So huge opportunities there. Next question comes in. With information being used as a tool of war and more to create division, and to your words, a theatre of war, to create division and anger, simple question, how can we combat this? What are some of your practical thoughts?
So there's lots of things that individually we can do. I would say always guard against your own outrage online. Number one, know that it's the easiest way of manipulating yourself. Slow down. Give yourself time to allow your kind of ratiocinatory brain to kick in, just to kind of like push your lizard brain slightly away before you share things. Number three, beware of the kind of passive scroll. Beware of all the kind of informational curation systems which basically feed you content. Try and use the internet and social media, if you're on it, a little bit more proactively. Kind of use your own will to shape it rather than allow it simply to shape you.
So when you say beware the passive scroll, what's the danger there? Isn't that how we enjoy consuming things? We let it all wash over us, but you see a hazard there?
I see a big hazard there because, like, whatever the kind of mechanisms, whether it's kind of social reputation or things that are trending and so on, they can all be gamed. And it's actually the entire profession of the people that are doing information warfare to understand those mechanisms and see how they can manipulate them. So what you're effectively doing, I think, is kind of making yourself prey, really, for a lot of mechanisms which really aren't foolproof. The same goes, in fact, actually for search engines. Right. A tiny white box, your window into the world, and they are subject to enormous amounts of gaming and reverse engineering.
Goodness me. So I've gone from feeling like a coffee bean to feeling like I'm in some big social media Petri dish this morning. Here's another question. What would be, here's a great question from Eric Hemming. Eric, what would be the effect of pulling the plug on the internet? There's a fairly massive question for you, Carl, at this time of the day.
Oh, yeah, golly, Ollie, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that one. I mean, clearly the costs would be astronomically more than the damages that the internet is currently inflicting on society by far. I mean, we've got to remember, and I spend most of my time researching all the ills of the internet. It is an amazing creative place that has allowed us to do things as a civilization that we never would have dreamed of doing before. I mean, we are like gods compared to the people of the past in terms of the information that we have at our fingertips. More now at click on Wikipedia than any Roman emperor ever had. So let's not forget all the benefits too. This is about protecting, one of the kind of great wonders of human civilization, not about getting rid of it.